A drunk man grabbed a young guy by the collar in a crowded bar. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. 30 people watched and did nothing. Then a waitress carrying a tray of drinks walked straight into the middle of it. No weapon, no backup, no plan. Just a woman who decided that standing still cost more than stepping in. What nobody in that room knew, what even she didn't know, was that the young man she just protected was the son of the most powerful and dangerous man in Detroit. And that one moment, that single, unremarkable act of ordinary courage, was about to pull her into a world she never asked to enter. A world where the man at the top was slowly being poisoned by the person he trusted most. A world where a 15-year-old secret was still breathing quietly in a small town in Oregon under a different name. This channel is about people who were born to lead, stories about the mafia boss, the ones who never appear in headlines, but move entire cities from the shadows. Because some lessons, the real ones, are never taught in any classroom. Only the men at the top know them. This is not a channel about crime. This is a channel about mindset, about nerve, and about the hidden architecture of real power. This story us will show you something most people spend a lifetime avoiding. That the bravest thing you can do is not fight back. It is step forward when everyone else has already decided to look away. And that sometimes the person who changes everything is not the one with the most power. It is the one who simply refuses to stand still. If that kind of story is what you came here for, like this video, drop a comment telling us where you are watching from tonight. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe. Because the next story is already waiting, and it does not disappoint.
Some stories begin with a gunshot. Some begin with a secret. This one begins with a spilled drink and a woman who didn't move out of the way. It was a Friday night, late October in Detroit. The kind of night where the cold comes in fast and the city smells like rain that hasn't fallen yet. The Anchor Bar on Midtown's east side was doing what it did every Friday, filling up slowly from the back, the way water fills a glass. Workers in from the factories, a few office types, loosening their ties. A table of younger guys in the corner, loud the way young guys get when they feel safe. Sonia Cross had been on her feet since 6 in the evening. She was 35 years old, average height, the kind of face that people forgot and then remembered later when it mattered. She wore her dark hair pulled back because the kitchen fans made a mess of everything else. Her work shirt had a small grease stain near the second button that she'd tried to wash out twice and given up on. 3 nights a week she worked at the Anchor, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. The rest of the time she sat in front of 2 computer monitors in her apartment and reviewed financial documents for industrial companies across the Midwest. That was her real job, forensic auditing, finding the numbers that didn't add up. She worked at the Anchor because 5 years ago, a case she worked went wrong in a way she hadn't predicted. She found the fraud. She submitted an accurate, complete report. The company collapsed. 340 people lost their jobs in a city already running on empty. The executives landed somewhere else within 3 months. The workers did not. She was right about the numbers. She was wrong about thinking that being right about the numbers was enough. After that, she needed a job where the consequences were immediate, clear, simple. You bring the food out, the person eats the food. That's it. No hidden damage. No ripple effect 6 months later that you didn't see coming. It wasn't a solution, but it helped her sleep. So on that Friday night, at 9:47 in the evening, Sonia was carrying a tray from the kitchen toward table 9 when Derek Malone stood up from his bar stool and walked toward the corner table. Derek was 51. He'd been drinking since 7 p.m. The bartender had been watching him and deciding whether to cut him off for the past 45 minutes, not because Derek was loud. He wasn't. He was the quiet kind of drunk, the kind that sits and stares at his glass like it owes him something, the kind that's harder to read until it's too late. Nobody knew why Derek chose that table. Maybe it was the way the kid was laughing. Maybe it was something about the easy posture, the confidence that comes from never having to worry about the rent. Maybe Derek was carrying something heavy that night and the weight had finally tipped. Kid's name was Eli Vale. He was 24. He was there with two friends, a guy named Cameron and another named Josh. It was a normal Friday night. He hadn't brought security guards because he'd told his father that morning that he didn't want security for every dinner, every drink, every time he went somewhere with his friends. His father had said nothing. That was an agreement. It was the silence of a man who knew he couldn't control everything and was still learning to accept that. Derek reached the table, said something. The tone was wrong from the first word. Eli stood up. Cameron and Josh stood up. A chair scraped back. Derek's voice went up a level. Nobody in the bar moved. The bartender reached for his phone. The manager in the back room hadn't heard it yet. The other customers were doing the thing people do in those moments, looking without looking, hoping it would resolve itself, not wanting to be the one. Sonia was 12 feet away with a full tray in her hands. She did not put the tray down. She did not call for the manager. She calculated, in the time it takes to blink, that if nobody did anything in the next 3 seconds, someone was going to get hurt. And she was the only person currently moving toward the situation rather than away from it. She walked straight into the space between Derek and Eli. She didn't try to be heroic about it. She placed the tray flat on the edge of the table, turned to face Derek, and spoke in the voice she used when a kitchen order came out wrong, and she needed to fix it without making it a bigger problem. She said, "Sir, this table is taken. Let me find you a seat back at the bar." That was it. Those words were not magic. What made them work was the delivery completely level, not scared, not aggressive. Just a statement of fact delivered by a person who had decided this situation was going to end quietly and was inviting Derek to agree with her. Derek looked at her. 1 second. The pause was enough. By the time the manager came out of the back room, Derek was being guided toward the door. The police were called. The situation ended without anyone going to the hospital. Eli Vale stared at Sonia after it was over. She had already picked up her tray and was heading toward table 9. He said, "Hey, thank you." She glanced back, nodded once, and kept moving. Cameron said to Eli, "Who was that?" Eli watched her walk away. "I have no idea." At 10:15 that night, Eli sat in his car in the parking lot and called his father. Marcus Vale answered on the second ring. He was in his office on the 22nd floor, jacket off, reading quarterly reports in a room that was mostly dark except for the desk lamp. Eli said, "You're not going to believe what happened tonight." Marcus listened. He asked one question, "Is he okay?" Eli said yes and kept going, because the point wasn't that it had almost gone wrong. The point was this woman who just walked in like it was nothing. Marcus said, "What's the name of the bar?" "The Anchor. Just making sure I know where you go." He hung up and sat in the quiet of his office for a long moment. Then he opened his laptop and typed 2 words into a search, "The Anchor Bar." At 5:47 the following morning, Marcus Vale stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his apartment and looked down at Detroit. He was 48 years old. Tall, lean in the way that comes from discipline, not luck. Gray at the temples, dark everywhere else. The kind of man who wore a suit the way other people wore skin naturally, without thinking about it. He held a cup of coffee in his right hand. His left hand was in his jacket pocket, thumb moving slowly around something small. A habit he'd developed 8 months ago, around the same time he got a diagnosis that changed the math of everything. He pulled the thing out of his pocket and looked at it. A small white pill, round, unremarkable. He looked at it for 4 seconds, then put it back. He didn't take it, it wasn't denial. It was something more specific than that. Taking that pill at 5:47 in the morning meant starting the day as a sick man. And Marcus Vale had spent 20 years being someone who did not start anything from a position of weakness. That was the story he told himself, anyway. The coffee went cold in his hand. He was the controlling partner in a network of industrial operations across Detroit manufacturing facilities, supply chains, union contracts, logistics companies, not a street organization, not violence and territory, something older and quieter. The kind of power that lives in boardrooms and side agreements and handshakes that are never written down. His name was known in certain rooms. In most rooms, it wasn't. He preferred it that way. At 6:30 he was in the office. The morning briefing went the way it always went. He sat at the head of the table and asked 3 questions and made 2 decisions, and the men around the table adjusted their plans accordingly. Twice during the meeting, his left hand trembled slightly. Not enough for anyone to notice across the width of the table. He moved his right hand on top of it both times. After everyone left, he sat down in the room for 90 seconds, with both hands flat on the table. He looked at his left hand. He watched it the way an engineer watches a part that's starting to show wear, noting it, filing it, not yet deciding what to do. Then he stood up and walked out. Leon Ashby came in as everyone else was leaving. He was 52, broad through the shoulders, moving with the kind of unhurried calm that belongs to people who haven't had to hurry in a long time. He had been at Marcus's side for 20 years. He was the person Marcus would have described, if asked, as the closest thing he had to someone he trusted. Leon placed a fresh glass water pitcher on the table, same spot as every morning. A habit so old it had stopped being noticed by anyone, including Marcus. He said, "Greystone Industrial. There's an independent auditor creating problems. 3 weeks in. Her name is Sonia Cross." Marcus drank from the pitcher. "What kind of problem?" Leon said, "The thorough kind." Marcus said, "Handle it quietly." Leon said, "Always." He left. Marcus looked at the pitcher, looked his left hand. Drank, one more sip. The narrator's voice, quiet as thought, said what Marcus was thinking but would never say out loud. A man who controls a city learns 2 things early: what everyone else is afraid of, and how to make sure they never find out what he is afraid of. 3 weeks after the night at the Anchor Bar, Sonia's home office looked like the inside of a structured mind. 2 monitors, color-coded folders, a small whiteboard on wheels that she'd moved from the living room because she needed to see the pattern she was tracking in physical form. Laid out, where she could walk away from it and come back. The pattern she was tracking belonged to Greystone Industrial. She'd been hired for a standard 8-week forensic audit, client compliance review, the kind of job she'd done 40 times before. But on the 3rd week, she found the number that didn't match. Then the second one. Then the structures behind them. Money from Greystone was flowing into a chain of 7 smaller companies on a 23-day cycle. Not 30 days, not monthly. 23. The number had no natural accounting rhythm. But it had been exactly 23 days without variation for 18 months. Someone had set a clock and never adjusted it. This was not crude money laundering. This was financial architecture, the kind you build when you're intelligent enough to make something that looks almost normal from every angle except that one. She should have filed her initial findings and let the process work. She knew that. She'd made a promise to herself after the Ohio case. When you have enough to report, you report. You don't wait for the full picture. The full picture is a luxury that sometimes costs more than it's worth. But she was built for complete understanding. It wasn't caution, it was perfectionism, and she knew the difference, and knowing it didn't help her stop. So she kept digging. On Wednesday evening, she drove home from a client meeting, taking the same route she always took. Partway through, she noticed a dark sedan that had been behind her since the second turn. She changed her route. The sedan didn't follow. She could have been wrong. She filed it anyway, mentally, the way she filed every data point clean, separate, no conclusions yet. When she got home, she called Nora, her former colleague, one of 3 people in the world who knew her location on any given evening. She said, "I might be being followed." Nothing confirmed. "I just wanted someone to know I'm home." Nora said, "Do you want me to come over?" Sonia said, "No. I'll let you know if anything changes." She hung up and made tea and sat at her desk and kept working. 2 days later, she came into her office and knew someone had been there. Not because anything was missing, because the room was too neat. She kept a specific kind of organized chaos, things stacked in particular angles, certain folders set a specific way. Someone had been through everything and put it back too carefully. They were looking for documents. They didn't find them because she didn't keep documents there. She'd learned that lesson 5 years ago, but she understood what the search meant. They were no longer just watching. They were looking for what she had found, which meant they knew she had found something, which meant either her client contact had talked or someone was monitoring her digital access. She sat at her desk for 3 minutes without moving. Then she opened the security application on her laptop, one she'd built with the help of a tech consultant after the Ohio case, and activated what she called the dead man switch. It was simple in concept. A package of encrypted documents stored on 4 independent servers in 4 different states. If she failed to send a check-in code within 72 hours, the package unlocked automatically and sent access instructions to 3 people. Nora, a lawyer named Patricia who owed her nothing but trusted her judgment, a journalist named Raymond who had worked with her once and would know what to do with the files. Activating the system didn't send anything. It just started the clock. She had built this after Ohio. She had never used it before. She set the countdown for 72 hours, sent her first check-in to reset it, and went to make more tea. She was coming out of the Anchor Bar at 10:30 that Wednesday night, walking to her car in the rear lot. The lot was lit by 2 overhead lights, one of which had been out for a week. The bays were mostly empty at this hour. A few cars scattered across the concrete. 2 men stepped out of the shadows, one from the left, one from the right. Not rushing, not shouting, just positioning. Sonia stopped. She was 11 feet from her car. The building's rear door was 28 feet behind her. The fire exit was 14 feet to her right, and the keypad needed a code she didn't have. She assessed all of this in about 2 seconds. Then she heard a voice, one word, clear and quiet: stop. Both men froze. Marcus Vale stepped forward from the darkness beside a concrete pillar. He wasn't wearing anything dramatic. A gray overcoat, hands in the pockets. He moved the way men move when they've spent decades being the person that rooms and adjusts to not fast, not slow, just steady. Like gravity. Sonia looked at him. She didn't step back. She cataloged him the way she cataloged anything that didn't yet have a label. The 2 men who had stopped moving on one word. The calm in his posture, the way he was looking at her, not threatening, measuring. She said, "Who are you?" He said, "Someone who needs to know what you found." She said, "And if I don't tell you?" He said, "Then I have a problem, and problems in my world tend to become everyone's problem." She looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she said, "That's the least reassuring thing anyone has said to me all week. And someone broke into my office yesterday." He didn't react to that the way she expected. He didn't get harder or more threatening. He got quieter. Like the information had weight and he was adjusting to it. He said, "Did you set up any kind of protection before tonight?" She said, "If I don't send a check-in code in the next 38 minutes, a package of documents goes to 3 people. That process is already running." A pause. He said, "You set that up before this conversation." She said, "I set it up 4 years ago, after a different situation." He looked at her for a moment that was longer than the ones before it. He said, "Smart." She said, "Cautious. There's a difference." He said, "Come with me." She said, "Where?" He said, "Somewhere that's not a parking lot." She thought about it. Not for long. But she actually thought about it, which he seemed to notice. She said, "I need to send my check-in code first." He said, "Take your time." She did. Then she followed him. The building was on 7th, a block from the riverfront. The lobby was unmanned at this hour. The elevator opened onto a 7th-floor corridor, with 3 unmarked doors. The room behind the middle door had a long table, 4 chairs, overhead lighting that was functional rather than comfortable, and no windows. It smelled faintly of paper and recycled air. Marcus sat on side of the table. Sonia sat across from him. His 2 men were not in the room. That was the first thing she noticed. The second thing she noticed was that he placed nothing on the table. No folder, no phone, no document of any kind. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at her, and she understood that this was a conversation, not a presentation. She said, "Before we start, I'm sending my check-in code." He nodded. She sent it. Then she put her phone face down on the table. He began with questions, specific, precise, the kind that told her he already knew the outline and was testing the borders of her knowledge. She answered 4 of them before she realized what was happening. She stopped answering. He waited. She said, "You already know what I found. You're not asking what it is. You're asking how much I understand about what it means." He said, "Yes," she said. "Then let me save us both time. I understand enough. And I've made arrangements so that what I understand doesn't disappear with me." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he's, "All right." And the tenor of the room changed, slightly. The way air pressure changes before weather. It wasn't warmer. Exactly. Just different. He said, "I want to propose something. You hold your findings for 60 days. In that time, I shut down the Greystone structure entirely. Clean. No workers lose their jobs. No supply chain collapse. When it's done, I give you complete documentation on everything, the full architecture, every company, every account. Enough to file your report with everything it needs." She said, "Why 60 days?" He said, "Because I need time to do it right." She said, That's not a reason, that's a timeline. What requires 60 days specifically?" He was quiet for a moment. She understood that he was deciding how much to say. He said, "I'm in the middle of a transition. Things done in a hurry tend to hurt people who didn't cause the problem." She thought about that. The phrasing, the specificity of it. She said, "You're stepping down." It wasn't a question. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. The silence was the answer. She said, "I'll tell you what I want in return." He said, "Go ahead." She said, "Documentation every 2 weeks. Specific, verifiable. Progress on the Greystone closure. Worker transitions, company dissolutions. I need to confirm the process is happening." He said, "You're auditing me." She said, "I'm auditing the process. There's a difference." Something moved in his expression, very small, like a door opening a quarter of an inch and then settling back. He said, "Agreed." They didn't shake hands right away. She spent another moment looking at him. She said, "There's one more thing." He waited. She said, "If anything happens to me during these 60 days, the system I described activates immediately, not 72 hours. Immediately." He said, "Nothing will happen to you." She said, "I'd prefer a structural guarantee over a personal assurance." He looked at her for a second. Then he said, "What would constitute a structural guarantee for you?" She said, "Weekly confirmation that the people watching me have been called off. If I don't receive confirmation, the clock accelerates." He said, "Done." Then they shook hands. On the drive home, she sat at a red light on Jefferson Avenue and talked to herself out loud, which was a habit she'd had since her mid-20s. She said, "You just made a deal with someone you know nothing about." Except that 2 men stopped moving because he said one word in a parking lot. The light changed. She said, "And the most unsettling part is the deal actually makes sense." She drove home, set her second check-in for 72 hours, went to bed at 1:30 in the morning and was asleep in 4 minutes, which surprised her. Marcus got back to his office at midnight. Leon was still there. He was almost always there when Marcus returned, regardless of the hour. 20 years of that. Marcus had stopped noticing how unusual it was a long time ago. Leon said, "Did you handle the cross situation?" Marcus said, "We have a 60-day arrangement. She holds her findings. We closed down Greystone correctly." Leon said, "You're negotiating with an auditor?" Marcus said, "She's thorough. And she's protected." He paused. "It's cleaner this way." Leon was quiet for a moment. He said, "I could handle it another way." Marcus said, "I know. I don't want that." He sat down at his desk and opened his laptop. After a few minutes, he was aware that Leon was still in the room. He looked up. Leon said, "You're sure?" Marcus said, "I'm sure." Leon nodded once. He picked up his coat and left. Marcus watched him go, then looked back at his screen. Reached into his jacket pocket with his left hand and turned something small between his fingers. A folded piece of paper. Old. The paper had gone soft at the creases from years of handling. He didn't take it out, just felt it there. Then he pulled his hand back out and got to work. The first package arrived on a Tuesday morning, 14 days after the meeting. Plain brown envelope. No return address. Delivered by a courier service whose name Sonia didn't recognize. Inside, 34 pages of documentation. Greystone industrial progress on worker placement, company structure changes, preliminary legal filings on the 7 smaller entities. She spent 3 hours reviewing it. Everything checked out. Not in the way that means someone had worked hard to make it look clean. In the way that means it was actually clean. She sent a reply to the email address she'd been given. Short, package received, consistent with commitments. Next review in 14 days. Marcus read it that morning while Leon stood across the room, reviewing his own reports. Leon said, "She's going to be a problem." Marcus said, "She's doing her job. That's not a problem. That's a control." Leon didn't say anything else. He took out his phone and added Sonia Cross to a list he kept privately. 12 days later, Sonia found something. Not fraud. Not a new problem. A technical error in the dissolution sequence for one of the 7 companies, a sequencing issue in the legal paperwork that, if not corrected before the next filing, would create a liability that would attach to whoever took over operations. It wasn't her problem to find. She'd been hired to audit Greystone. This was downstream, but she found it. And if she said nothing and it landed on the successor, that successor would spend 18 months in litigation over something that should have been a 2-day fix. She sent a message, found something in the latest package. Not fraud. Needs to be corrected before the next filing. When can you meet? He replied within 10 minutes. Tomorrow, 11 a.m. You pick the location. She picked a coffee shop on Woodward called the Daily Press. Public. Unremarkable. The kind of place that was always full enough to be anonymous. He arrived alone. No Leon. No security. He walked in wearing a dark jacket, ordered black coffee at the counter, and found her at a table near the back window. She showed him the error. He asked 3 questions, technical, specific, in exactly the right order. By the time he'd asked the second one, she understood that he had grasped the problem fully. He said, "I'll handle it personally." She said, "Why tell me you'll handle it personally? You could just say it'll be fixed." He said, "If I say it'll be fixed and it isn't, you blame the process. If I say I'll handle it and it isn't, you know exactly who to blame. Specific accountability is more accurate." She considered that. She said, "That's not a common way of thinking." He said, "It's the only way I've found that actually works." She thought again about the kind of man who ran industrial operations in the gray space between legal and illegal, who answered questions about accountability the way a professor might, who sat alone in a coffee shop and ordered black coffee and fixed sequencing errors in corporate dissolution documents. She thought about the fact that none of those things added up to what she'd expected when she got into his car 2 weeks ago. She looked down at the table for a moment. There was a piece of paper on it, small, folded into quarters. He had placed it there at some point without her noticing, and his right hand was resting near it, the index finger touching the edge. While they talked, he turned it between his fingers. Not consciously. A habit, like tapping a pen or clicking a lighter, except there was something in how he held it, not like a fidget, like something he kept. When she looked down at it, his hand moved and the paper disappeared into his inside jacket pocket. She didn't ask. They were packing up to leave when it happened. He stood and reached for his coat, put his right arm through, reached back for the left. His left hand went to the 3rd button, and the tremor hit, small but unmistakable. His fingers fumbled the button. He stopped. Waited. The tremor passed. He tried again. Got the button. Sonia had seen it. She was sliding her folder into her bag, and she saw it from the edge of her vision. She didn't look directly at him. She didn't look away in the exaggerated way that would have told him she was pretending. She zipped her bag, stood up, picked up her coffee cup, and carried it to the bus tray by the door. By the time she turned back, he had the coat buttoned and was ready to go. She said, "Same timeline for the next package?" He said, 2 weeks. She said, "I'll be in touch." They walked out separately. She went to her car. He went to his. His car. Marcus sat for a moment before starting the engine. He put his left hand on the steering wheel. The tremor had passed. Just the normal shake of a hand that sometimes forgot to behave. He thought about what she had done. Not the looking away thing. She hadn't done that. She had just continued. Like there was nothing unusual happening. Like the moment was not weighted in the way that moments like that always felt when other people witnessed them. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had done that. He started the engine. Meanwhile, In a private medical office on the west side of Detroit, Dr. Grace Tillman was sitting at her desk at 7 in the morning with 3 charts in front of her. Marcus Vale's progression charts. 3 months ago. 2 months ago. Last month. She was a practical woman. She had been Marcus's physician for 11 years. She asked the questions she needed to ask, and none of the ones she didn't. She understood who her patient was and what that meant in terms of what got discussed and what didn't. But she was looking at these charts, and something was wrong. The condition Marcus had was called a progressive neurological degeneration. Rare, slow-moving as these things go. She had seen 4 cases in her career. The pattern was predictable, a slow, steady, gradual decline. Some weeks better, some worse, but always within a band that she could plot on a curve. Marcus's last 8 months weren't on that curve. The acceleration was wrong. And the pattern wasn't random variation, it had shape. It rose at intervals, leveled, rose again. She had seen patterns like that once before, in medical school. In a toxicology case study. She didn't let herself use that word yet. She got up, went to the cabinet where she stored samples from patient visits, and found the sealed sample from Marcus's last physical. She labeled it with a number, not a name, packed it into a courier bag, addressed it to a lab in Cleveland she'd used twice for off-record testing. She sent it out that afternoon. She told no one. It was a Tuesday, 3.5 weeks into the 60-day agreement, when Jeffrey Marsh called. Sonia was between client calls when her cell rang with a number she didn't recognize. She answered it out of the professional habit of always answering unknown numbers. The man on the other end identified himself as Jeffrey Marsh, representing a firm called Vantage Partners. He said they were aware she was conducting an audit of Greystone Industrial. He said they understood she had made significant findings. He said they would like to offer her a fee. He named a figure that was approximately 22 months of her normal income in exchange for filing her report within the next 5 business days, regardless of any existing timeline. She said, no. He started to say, Mrs. Cross, if you'll allow me to explain the full. She said, no, don't call me again. She hung up. She sat still for a moment. Then she opened a new document on her computer and typed, date, time, caller name, company, offer amount, exact language used, declined, will not speak to this person again. She saved the file. Then she added it to the encrypted package on her secure server. She thought about the call for a long time. Vantage Partners knew she was auditing Greystone. They knew she had found something. They knew she had an existing timeline that she might be willing to abandon for the right number. Only 2 people knew about her arrangement with Marcus. Marcus and whoever he had told. Unless he hadn't told anyone. Unless someone close to him had simply paying attention. That afternoon, Marcus called her. He said, you were approached this morning. She was quiet for a second. The way he said it past tense told her he had known before she did. She said, you're watching me. He said, I'm watching everyone who knows what you know. That's not the same thing. She said, did you know they would approach me? He said, no. Which means someone told them. And the only people who knew about our arrangement, she finished it, are you and whoever you told. A long pause. He said, I didn't tell anyone. She listened to how he said it. Clean, no qualification, no defensive angle. She said, then someone found out another way. He said, yes. She said, someone close to you. Another pause, longer. He said, that's what I'm looking at. He did what he had always done when he needed to confirm a suspicion without alerting the person he suspected. He built a test. In a private conversation with Leon the following day, he mentioned casually that Sonia Cross was preparing a supplemental audit document, additional findings she planned to file with her standard report on the following Friday. The document didn't exist. If Vantage Partners contacted Sonia about this supplemental filing before Friday, the test would be conclusive. Leon had been at his side for 20 years. Marcus ran the test with the same flat efficiency he applied to every problem. Not because it was easy, because emotion was not a diagnostic tool. He noted Leon's reaction when the information was delivered. Nothing unusual. Leon nodded, made a note, and continued the meeting. Marcus watched him carefully. He saw nothing definitive, which could have meant Leon was innocent. Or it could have meant that Leon, who had been reading Marcus for 20 years, understood that this was exactly the kind of conversation a man tests with. Marcus filed both possibilities and went back to work. 2 nights later, Sonia called him. It was 11 at night. He was still at his desk. She said, "They called again. Different person, same offer." This time they mentioned a supplemental filing due Friday. He was quiet. She said, "That information doesn't exist publicly, Marcus." The use of his name registered. She had never used it before. He said, "I know." She said, "Which means," he said, "I know what it means." She said, "Are you all right?" The question surprised him, not because it was inappropriate, because it was the kind of question that required someone to actually look at you before asking it, and she was 4 miles away on the other end of a phone. He said, "Call me if they contact you again." She said, "Marcus." He stopped. She said, "Are you all right?" He stayed on the line for 2 more seconds. Then he said, "Good night, Sonia." He ended the call and sat with the phone in his hand. The question stayed in the room after he put the phone down. He hadn't answered it. He wasn't sure he knew how. The results came back from the Cleveland lab on a Thursday morning. Grace Tillman sat at her desk and read them 3 times. The sample from Marcus's water bottle contained trace amounts of a synthetic compound, no commercial name, identified by molecular structure. The concentration was low. Low enough to be invisible in a standard blood panel, low enough to produce no acute symptoms, but the compound was a documented neurological accelerant. In isolated laboratory conditions, it had been shown to increase the rate of certain types of neurological degradation by a factor of 2 to 3 times over a sustained exposure period. Someone had been putting it in his water. Not enough to kill him quickly, enough to make a slow condition faster. Enough to take a trajectory that might have given him years and shorten it dramatically. She sat with that information for 10 minutes. Then she wrote 2 words on a notepad, looked at them, and crossed them out. Then she put on her coat and drove to Marcus's office. She arrived at 9:30. His assistant tried to redirect her to the calendar. She said, "Tell him it's Grace. Tell him it's not a phone call." He was shown in at 9:45. She placed 2 sheets of paper on his desk, her own clinical notes summarizing the implications. She didn't say anything. He read both pages. He was a fast reader. He went through the lab report in about 90 seconds. His eyes went slower over her notes. He read those twice. He put the papers down. He looked out the window. The city was doing what it always did. Traffic. People. The river in the distance catching late morning light. He said, "How long?" She said, "Based on concentration levels found in the sample, 6 to 8 months. Possibly longer if the initial doses were lower." He said, "The compound. You said it requires medical." She said, "Advanced medical knowledge. Or access to someone who has it. This is not something you find in a general toxicology reference. You'd need to understand the specific pharmacological interaction with your condition." He said, "What happens if we remove the exposure?" She said, "The acceleration stops. The underlying condition continues. The compound doesn't cause the disease. It just speeds it up. Remove it, and we go back to the natural progression." He said, "And the natural progression," she said, "is significantly slower than what I've seeing. Get you on a proper treatment protocol now that I know what I'm actually treating. We're talking years, not the timeline I had been projecting." He was quiet. She said, "Marcus, do you know who did this?" He looked at his left hand. It was resting on the desk, still. He said, "I have a suspicion I don't want to be right about." She said, "Someone who has access to your water every day." He said, "Yes." She said, "I'll start designing a treatment protocol. It needs to be someone I can trust completely in neuropharmacology." He said, "Do it. Don't tell anyone what you found until I tell you to." She gathered the papers, stood up. At the door, she paused. She said, "For what it's worth, the fact that you're still functioning the way you are, at this stage after 8 months of exposure, means your baseline is stronger than either of us knew." He didn't respond. She left. He didn't call anyone. He didn't open his laptop. He picked up the water pitcher that was on his desk, the one that had been there every morning for 20 years, and carried it to his assistant's desk. He said, "Get rid of this." She said, "Of course." "Should I get you something else?" She said, Just water from the kitchen. He went back in and closed the door. He stood at his desk for a long time. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out the folded piece of paper. He opened it for the first time in a long time. It was small. The paper had gone pale at the creases. The handwriting was a woman's blue ink, slightly rushed. An address in Oregon, partially faded, and below it, a single sentence. Call me when you're ready. D. He stood there with that piece of paper open in his hands. Then he folded it back up, carefully, along the same creases, placed it in his pocket, sat down. He said to the empty room, in a voice that was very quiet and very flat, 20 years. The only person in this building every morning before me and every evening after me. The only person who would know which compound to use. The only person who places that picture on my desk. He said the name. Leon. Leon figured it out on a Thursday. He was reviewing a summary from one of the Vantage partners, contacts a routine check-in on the Greystone situation, when the contact mentioned the supplemental filing due Friday. Leon stopped. He had been told about that filing by Marcus 3 days ago. It wasn't in any external communication. It hadn't been mentioned to anyone else. He sat in his car in the parking structure of his apartment building for 14 minutes. He was not a man who panicked. Panic was the enemy of clear thinking, and Leon had survived in a difficult world for 52 years by maintaining clear thinking in situations where other people panicked. He ran the analysis. Marcus suspected a leak. Marcus had created the supplemental filing as a test. Marcus had told only Leon. The information had reached Vantage Partners. Marcus knew it was Leon. Or, and this was the possibility, Leon held alongside. The first Marcus strongly suspected it was Leon and was still building toward certainty. In which case, there was still a window. The question was how to close it. Leon thought about this for a long time. If Marcus had already confirmed the compound, and Leon had to assume Grace had eventually found something, she was too careful not to, then the situation was further along than he had hoped. He had planned for more time. He had planned for a slower unraveling, one he could manage from the inside. That time was gone. The only move left was to create a situation that pulled Marcus's attention outward rather than inward, something that required immediate action. Something that put Marcus in the position of protector rather than investigator. The most obvious candidate was Sonia Cross. She was already in the field, already a pressure point. If the pressure on her escalated, if she became an active problem, rather than a managed one, Marcus would have to respond. And a Marcus who was responding to an external crisis was not a Marcus who was sitting quietly and rebuilding a case against his closest ally. Leon called Jeffrey Marsh. He said, "Change the approach. Stop trying to buy her cooperation. Start making her situation untenable. I want her to feel like she can't wait 60 days. Marsh said. How far? Leon said, far enough that she calls him. Sonia noticed the change on a Monday. The car that had followed her once 3 weeks ago was back. This time it didn't disappear when she changed her route. It was there when she left her apartment. There when she came back. There outside the coffee shop, where she worked for 3 hours in the afternoon. This was not surveillance anymore. This was visible. Deliberate. Someone wanted her to know she was being watched. She went home, sat at her desk, thought it through. Whoever was doing this wasn't trying to collect information. They already knew where she was. This was about pressure, making her feel like the 60-day agreement was costing her more than it was worth. She reset her dead man switch countdown from 72 hours to 12. Then she called Marcus. She said something changed. The surveillance stopped being subtle today. It's been on me all day, visible. Someone wants me to know. He said, "Where are you right now?" She said, "Home." He said, "Stay there. Don't open the door. I'm coming." She said, "Marcus, I'm not going to." He said, "Sonia." She stopped. He said, "Stay there, please." She didn't say anything for a second. It was the please that did it. She had never heard him say please before. She said, "Okay." He came to her apartment and drove her to a safe location, a fifth-floor unit in Corktown that he owned through a management company. Clean, simple, a couch, a kitchen, 2 windows overlooking the street. They sat at the small kitchen table at 11 in the evening. He was walking her through the short-term plan, a period of 5 to 7 days where he needed to confirm the source before making a move when his left hand knocked the water glass off the table. The glass fell, hit the tile, didn't break. He looked at his hand. He didn't put his right hand over it. He didn't move to pick up the glass. He just looked at it. Sonia got up, picked up the glass, set it in the sink, came back with a dish towel and wiped the small puddle of water. She sat back down. She said, "How long have you had that?" He said, 8 months, officially. She waited. He said, "Unofficially, I think someone helped it along." She said, "What do you mean?" He said, "My doctor found a compound in my water, something that is the condition I already have." Sonia was quiet. He said, "She found it 4 days ago." She said, "Have you confirmed who?" He said, "I have a very specific suspicion. I don't have absolute confirmation yet." She said, "Is it someone close to you?" He said, "Yes." She said, "The hardest evidence is always the evidence that proves someone trusted." He said, "Yes, exactly that." They sat across from each other in the small kitchen at 11 p.m. The refrigerator hummed. Car passed outside. She said, "I'm sorry, for what it's worth." He shook his head slightly, not dismissing it, just acknowledging that words didn't reach this kind of thing. Then he took the folded paper out of his jacket pocket. He placed it on the table between them. He didn't open it. He said, "There's something else. Something that happened 15 years ago that I think connects to everything that's happening now. I'm not ready to tell you all of it, but I want you to know it exists." She looked at the piece of paper on the table. She said, "Okay." He said, "Okay." She said, "When you're ready. I'm not going anywhere tonight anyway." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Not with gratitude or relief, just acknowledgement. The paper stayed on the table between them. They kept working. The next morning, Marcus was at the table with his laptop, working through the final documentation on the Greystone transition. Sonia was on the couch, reviewing the latest audit notes. She had made coffee. She'd found the machine in the cabinet, found the grounds, made it without being asked, without making anything of it. She was going through a physical folder Marcus had left on the table, cross-referencing a few items when a photograph fell out. It was a standard 4x6, slightly faded, printed on regular paper. A woman, middle distance, shot from the side. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking out a window, and the late afternoon light was coming from behind, and you could see the line of her face clearly. Sonia picked it up. She looked at it. The recognition didn't come all at once. It came the way it does with people you've met once in a context you didn't expect to remember, a slow assembly, piece by piece, like a puzzle you didn't know you'd started. 3 years ago, Portland, Oregon. A small accounting firm. A 2-week forensic review, unremarkable. She had spoken with maybe 12 staff members over the course of the job. One of them was named Helen. Helen worked in accounts payable. Middle-aged. Quiet. Professional, nothing unusual about her except a single thing that Sonia had noticed and filed the way she filed everything unusual, without immediate judgment, just stored. Every time someone mentioned Detroit in conversation, Helen changed the subject. Not obviously. Not dramatically. Just redirected. Smoothly. The way someone does when they've been doing it long enough that it's become reflexive. It happened 3 times in 2 weeks. Sonia had noted it. Hadn't understood it. Left it filed. The woman in this photograph was Helen. She was sure. She looked at the photograph for a long time to be and she was. She placed it on the table. She said, "Who is this?" Marcus looked up. He saw the photograph. Something in his face changed, not much, but she was watching for it. He said, "Someone I knew a long time ago." She said, "Is she still alive?" He said, "No." She said, "Are you certain?" He went still. She said, "3 years ago, I did an audit in Portland. There was a woman there named Helen. She worked in accounts payable. The woman in this photo is Helen." He didn't speak. She said, "I remember her because she had one specific habit. Every time someone mentioned Detroit in conversation, she would change the subject. Every time. For 2 weeks. Still nothing from him. She said, 'She's alive.' Or she was 3 years ago." He looked at the photograph. She watched his face. She had done this job for 10 years. She knew what it looked like when a person's understanding of sync fundamentals shifted, when the architecture of a whole period of their life needed to be rebuilt from a different premise. It looked like this. He said, very quietly, she didn't leave. Sonia said, no. He said, she was sent away. And someone told me she was dead. He said the last part as a statement, not a question. Like a man finishing an equation he'd had the first half of for 15 years and had just been handed the rest. He said, who told you her name? She said, she introduced herself as Helen. I didn't know there was another name. He nodded slowly. He said, her name is Diane. He said the name carefully, like it was something that still cost him something to say. He called Leon at 2 in the afternoon. He said, come to the office, alone. Leon arrived at 3:30. He came in looking the way he always looked, unhurried, settled the way a man looks when he believes he still controls the situation. The office was just the two of them. On the desk were two items: the lab report from Grace, photograph of Diane. Leon looked at the desk. He sat down without being invited, because his legs needed to. Marcus said, do you know anything about this? He placed his hand on the lab report. Leon looked at it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I never wanted to hurt you. Marcus said, Diane is alive. Leon looked at him. Marcus said, she was alive. Someone sent her away, then told me she died. He said it slowly, each sentence separate, like laying tiles one at a time, building toward the floor. He said, and for 8 months someone has been adding something to my water that makes my condition worse. He said, help me understand, Leon. 20 years. Help me understand. Leon sat with his hands on his knees and looked at a point somewhere between the desk and the floor. Then he looked up, and he told the truth. All of it. In the voice of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had run out of ways to keep carrying it. He talked for a long time. Diane, 15 years ago, Leon had seen her as the thing that would take Marcus away. Not because she was a bad person, because she was a good one. Because Marcus had wanted to change his life for her to build something different, something outside the organization, something that didn't need Leon in it. And Leon had looked at that future and felt a fear he had never felt before. He'd gone to Diane himself. One visit. He'd told her that her presence put Marcus in danger, that there were people who would use her to get to him. Some of that was even true. He'd told her that the most loving thing she could do was leave, that Marcus would be safer without the vulnerability. She had believed him, because she loved Marcus enough to choose his safety over her own needs. Leon had watched her pack. He'd arranged the transportation. He'd waited until she was gone, and then he'd gone to Marcus and said, with the steady voice of a man delivering terrible news he wished he didn't have to deliver, that there had been an accident, that Diane was gone. Marcus had not cried in front of Leon. But Leon knew what it had done. He had watched it happen. Over the months that followed the shutting down, the closing off, the man who decided that a life without that kind of opening was a life with fewer vulnerabilities. Leon had told himself he had protected Marcus. He had believed that for 15 years. The compound was different. He admitted that. When Marcus had announced 8 months ago that he was preparing to step down and transition the organization, Leon had understood for the first time that his own position was ending. Not dramatically, not with a dismissal. Just quietly, the way things end when they're no longer needed. Marcus would move on. New people would come in. And Leon would be thanked warmly and made irrelevant. He could not accept that. He had found the compound through a contact he had cultivated years ago for situations that required chemical rather than physical solutions. He had introduced it to the water pitcher in doses small enough to be undetectable. Not to kill, to slow Marcus down, to maintain the dependency, to keep Marcus in a state where stepping back was harder than staying. He said, I couldn't let you go. He said it like a confession. Like it was the truest thing he'd said in 20 years since. Marcus sat across from him. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, you took 15 years from me, from her, from whatever we could have been. Leon said, I know. Marcus said, you took them because you believed you were protecting me. But you were protecting yourself from a future where you weren't necessary. Those are two different things, and you've been calling one of them the other for a very long time. Leon didn't say anything. Marcus said, "Leave." Leon stood. He was slower than usual. He looked at Marcus once more the way you look at something when you know you won't see it again. He said, "Marcus." Marcus said, "Leon." One word, just the name. Final. Leon walked out. Marcus sat in the empty office. He reached into his jacket pocket, took out the folded paper, held it in both hands without opening it. He sat there for a long time. 3 days later, Marcus sat across from his attorney in a corner office on the 14th floor of a building that had nothing to do with his operations. He placed the lab report on the table. Grace's clinical notes. A documented chain of custody for the water pitcher samples. A timeline. He said, "I want this handled through the legal system, not another way." The attorney, a measured woman named Patricia, looked at the documents, then looked at him. She said, "This means public record. His name attached to criminal charges. There will be a trial, media attention possibly." Marcus said, "I know." She said, "There are quieter options." He said, "Those quiet options are exactly what he used on Diane for 15 years. And on me for 8 months. I won't repeat the method." She was quiet for a moment. He said, the most honest thing I can do for a man who spent 20 years lying to me is make sure he has to tell the truth in front of a judge." She gathered the documents, said she would need a week to prepare the filing. He said, "Take the time you need. Do it right." He stood to go. She said, "Marcus, for what it's worth, the compound was detected because your doctor was paying attention. That's not nothing." He said, "No, it isn't." He left. Grace's updated assessment came 2 weeks later. They met in her office. She placed 2 charts in front of him. She said, "With the compound removed and the treatment protocol started, your progression curve returns to natural baseline. We're looking at a significantly different timeline than what I projected before." He said, "Define significantly." She said, "Potentially 3 to 5 years before meaningful functional impact, possibly longer. The underlying condition is still there, but the artificial acceleration is gone." He was quiet. She said, "I know you were planning to step down regardless. Does this change the timeline?" He said, "No." She said, "Why not?" He said, "Because I was stepping down before I knew about the compound. I'm still stepping down now. The plan doesn't change." She said, "Then what changes?" He thought about that. He said, "The reason. Before, I was stepping down because I thought I was running out of time. Now, I'm stepping down because it's the right thing to do. Same action, different reason." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "That distinction matters more than you think." He said, "I'm starting to understand that." He wrote the letter on a Sunday night. He sat at the kitchen table in his apartment, not the office. The kitchen with a pen and a piece of paper and a cup of coffee that went cold before he finished. He wrote, "I know you're alive. I know you left because someone told you it was the only way to protect me. I know you didn't choose to disappear. I'm not angry. Not at you. Not at any of this. I just needed you to know that I know. The story I was told and believed for longer than I should have wasn't the truth. I'm sorry it took this long to find out. You don't owe me anything. Not a call, not an explanation, not a meeting. This isn't a request. It's the truth going back to the person who deserved to have it 15 years ago." He addressed the envelope to the Oregon address from the old piece, corrected for the current year. Mailed it the next morning from a post office box downtown. No return address, no tracking, no confirmation requested. He walked out of the post office and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, his hands in his pockets. Then he went back to work. That same week, he called Sonia. She was back in her apartment, Greystone audit in its final stretch. He said, "I wanted you to know the situation with Leon is being handled through legal channels. You're not in danger anymore." She said, "I heard. Patricia filed the charges yesterday." He said, "You know Patricia?" She said, "She's one of my 3 contacts, the dead man's switch lawyer." A pause. "Small world," he said. "Apparently." She said, "And your health?" "Grace's treatment?" He said, "Started last week. The projection is better than it was." She said, "I'm glad." A beat. He said, "Sonia, I want to ask you something." She said, "Go ahead." He said, "You worked as a waitress 3 nights a week for 4 years. A woman with your background, your income level why?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "After the Ohio case. The fraud case I told you about. I needed a job where the consequence of my work was immediate, visible, simple. Bring the food out, bring the food and gets the food. No kitchen damage, he said. You needed to feel like what you did was good. She said, I needed to feel like what I did was clear. Whether it was good was secondary, he said, and now? Now, I've rebuilt my process. Every audit I do includes a human impact assessment. It's not required. Require it for myself. A pause. It doesn't fix what happened, but it means I'm not ignoring the same variable twice, he said. You found a way to carry it without putting it down. She said, that's one way of saying it. He said, the only way I've found that works, actually. The night the Greystone Agreement expired exactly 60 days after their meeting in the room, with no windows, Marcus sent the final package. It arrived in Sonia's inbox at midnight. Complete documentation. Every company, every account, every transaction, more than enough to file a full report. She read it until 3 in the morning. When she finished, she sat at her desk and thought about what to do with it. She had agreed to hold the information for 60 days. The 60 days were over. The agreement was fulfilled. She could file the report. She had the grounds. She had the documentation. She had the contacts at the appropriate regulatory agencies. She looked at the Greystone worker transition files. 312 people, all placed, same or better contracts. Companies that had been vetted, done correctly the way he'd said it would be done. She could close the report file. She would keep the documentation. She would file it when, and if the situation warranted, if other information came to light, if someone needed it. But filing it right now would trigger proceedings that would catch the people who were already gone and land hardest on the people who had nothing to do with the architecture. That was her call to make, not his. She put the file in a secure folder labeled Greystone Complete, held. She sent him a single message, package received, full documentation confirmed. I'm keeping the files. Our agreement is complete. He replied at 12:47 ASM, understood. Thank you. She read that twice, then put her phone face down. 6 weeks later, 3 scenes, no narration, just what happened. The first scene was in Sonia's apartment on a Tuesday morning in December. She was at her desk, working on a new contract, a manufacturing company in Milwaukee, that needed a compliance review before the end of the fiscal year. Standard work. The kind that kept the lights on. Her email pinged. The sender name was blank. The address was one she recognized. The message had no text, just an attachment. A preliminary financial summary for a company called Lakeside Industrial Services, with a handwritten note scanned at the bottom of the last page. The note said Q4 payroll versus declared income has a 23% variance from industry standard. Thought you might find it interesting. MV. She opened the summary, read the first page, looked at the payroll to income ratio, said nothing for a moment. Then she opened a new browser tab and started researching Lakeside Industrial Services. The corner of her mouth moved, very slightly. She kept working. The second scene was in a waiting room. Grace Tillman's office, west side of Detroit, a Wednesday morning. Marcus sat in one of the 4 chairs in the waiting area. He was the only person there. He was 10 minutes early for his appointment, the first time in 11 years that he had arrived early for anything. He wasn't reading. He wasn't on his phone. He was just sitting. In his hands was the old folded piece of paper. He turned it over once, then opened it. The original address in Oregon was crossed out with a single horizontal line. Clean. Decisive. Next to it, in a different pen, a different hand, a different time. A phone number, an Oregon area code. He looked at the number for a moment. Then he folded the paper along its original creases and put it back in his inside jacket pocket, closer to his chest than he used to carry it. Not because he had forgotten it could hurt, because he had decided that was no longer the right reason to keep things at a distance. The receptionist called his name. He stood up, walked in. The third scene was a room that nobody would have chosen. A waiting area in a county facility on the north side. Plastic chairs, fluorescent lights, a television mounted high on the wall with the sound off, showing a talk show nobody was watching. Leon Ashby sat in one of the chairs. He was wearing the kind of clothes that don't carry history, a plain jacket, regular pants. Nothing that said who he had been. He was waiting for his preliminary hearing. He sat with his hands on his knees. He looked straight ahead. There was nothing to read in his expression. Not defiance, not regret, not fear. Just a man sitting in a room, waiting for what came next, without anyone beside him for the first time in 20 years. The narrator spoke. The voice was even. The kind of voice that has learned that saying things simply is more honest than saying them beautifully. He had spent 20 years being the most informed person in any room he entered. He knew which contracts were about to shift, which alliances were forming, who was lying, and about what and to whom. He had built an entire life on the principle that information was protection, and yet, the things that actually changed the shape of his days hadn't come from information. They came from a woman who stepped into the space between two men in a parking lot on a Friday night for no reason, except that it was the right moment and she was the right person and she chose to. They came from a doctor who ran a test she wasn't asked to run because the numbers didn't add up and she couldn't ignore numbers that didn't add up. They came from an auditor who worked 3 nights a week serving food in a bar because she needed to feel like the consequences of her work were immediate and clear. None of that was information. It turns out that information and truth are not the same thing, and the distance between them is exactly the size of the space where someone you trusted used to stand. He understood that now. He was still learning what to do with it. There was a phone call coming from an Oregon number. Not yet, but coming. He knew that the way he knew things that hadn't happened yet, when everything that needed to happen had already been set in motion. When it came, he would answer it. And for the first time in 15 years, he was not going to have a plan ready before he picked up. He was just going to answer the phone and see what the truth sounded like when nobody was managing it. That was enough. That was all it needed to be. The narrator paused one last time. If this story stayed with you tonight, if you have ever held the weight of a complicated truth about someone you needed to trust, or been the person who held the truth back and told yourself it was for someone else's good, then you know what this story is actually about. It is not about power. Not really. It is about the cost of closing a door that should have stayed open, and about what happens when someone on the outside doesn't have the decency to knock before walking through it. The cost was 15 years of a life that didn't need to be lived alone. The man paid it. The woman paid a version of it too, smaller, different in shape, but the same in kind. What came after the paying was not a happy ending. Not the kind where everything resolves and everyone gets what they were always supposed to have. That's not what real life does. What came after was something quieter and harder and more durable than a happy ending. What came after was a Tuesday morning and a financial spreadsheet sheet and a variance that still needs looking into, a waiting room and an early appointment and a piece of paper with a new phone number. A woman at a desk who doesn't delete the email address of someone she hasn't decided about yet. What came after was the thing that comes after any honest accounting. Not resolution, continuation, which is its own kind of grace. Take care of yourself tonight. We'll be here. This work of fiction is a product of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or locales is purely coincidental. The narrative is intended solely for artistic and entertainment purposes and should not be interpreted as a reflection of real individuals or factual occurrences.
Before we close tonight, I want to stay with this story for just a moment longer because this was never really about a drunk man in a bar, and it was never really about a mafia boss or a waitress or a 60-day deal between two strangers. This story was about something much quieter than all of that, something most of us carry without a name for it. It was about the cost of closing yourself off and what happens when life refuses to let you stay closed. Marcus Vale spent 15 years believing the woman he loved had died. He built an entire identity around that loss, not grieving it, containing it, turning it into armor. And for 15 years, that armor worked until the one person who had helped him build it turned out to be the same person slowly taking him apart from the inside. Here is the first lesson this story teaches us. The most dangerous betrayal is not the one that comes from your enemy. It comes from the person who has decided quietly and completely that they cannot exist without you. Love without boundaries is not love. It is ownership. And ownership, when it feels threatened, will do things that love never would. Leon did not see himself as a villain. That is what made him so dangerous. He believed every choice he made was an act of devotion. He had confused protecting someone with controlling them, and he had been doing it for so long that he no longer saw the difference. There are people like Leon in every life. They don't announce themselves. They show up early and stay late and make themselves indispensable. And by the time you understand what that has cost you, the years are already gone. Here is the second lesson. Courage is not always loud. Sometimes it looks like a woman carrying a tray of drinks who steps into a space nobody else will enter. Not because she is fearless, because she calculated in a single moment that the cost of standing still was higher than the cost of moving forward. That is not heroism in the dramatic sense. That is moral clarity under pressure. And it is far rarer than we admit. And the third lesson, perhaps the most important one, the truth does not disappear because you stop looking for it. It waits 15 years in a small town in Oregon under a different name. The truth is patient in ways that we are not. What this story ultimately asks is simple. Are you carrying something you have convinced yourself is gone? Are you protecting someone, or are you protecting yourself from the risk of needing them? And is there a letter you have been meaning to write that deserves to be written before another 15 years quietly pass? Those are not comfortable questions, but the stories worth telling never ask comfortable ones.